Greetings all, and welcome to the 6th segment of A Traveler's Guide to for Zebes. And today, we'll be continuing with our examination of the planet with the next segment, A Traveler's Guide to Maridia. Maridia acted as the only major body of water in Zebes, and was completely subterranean in nature, making its existence even more of a mystery regarding the otherwise hostile nature of the planet. It is possible, though, that the water came from the asteroid and crateria that had managed to penetrate into the solid rock of the surface, where having the acidic compounds in it strained out, and in doing so, created an area where aquatic life could thrive. Maridia was effectively split into 3 major sections. Upper Maridia was the part that was closest to the surface, and was generally the only area where pockets of free air existed, and thus the caverns were not completely submerged in water. Sandstone acted as a sturdy support for the ceilings of these caverns, and was the only part of Maridia where lush vegetation grew that was not entirely aquatic in nature. The creatures that occupied this zone were fairly benign and were relatively non-threatening, although it was still worth looking around as there were some useful items contained within it. Base Maridia was the area that essentially connected Maridia to the crateria, and especially the wrecked ship, and was characterized by its green stone and the absence of nearly any type of artificial manipulation or alteration. The creatures that lived here were of little consequence to most explorers, as they were easy to eliminate, and the area in general just felt abandoned, though that was still a better feeling than that in the lower reaches of the area. Lastly, sandy Maridia comprised the central and lower bulk of this land, and had been heavily modified and taken over by the Zebesian space-powered forces. The area was filled with metal supports and cabins containing a myriad array of experimental creatures, including mock droids, and was otherwise characterized by its presence of many sandy pits. While some of these pits were natural in origin, most of them were created accidentally when the space pilots used robots like the Shack tool to dig through the sand of Maridia in order to carve out more space for their base, equipment, and experiments. Their construction caused some minor seismic activity in the area that caused liquefaction of the sandy sediments, generating massive pits and waterfalls of sand that were ultimately unable to control or stop. This aquatic paradise in the planet was also home to one of the Zebesian space-powered generals under the command of Mother Brain, Dragon, who was slain at the hands of the Hunter in a mission to stop Mother Brain from releasing the new apocalypse with her Metroids. Before we take a good look at the unique biota of this area, it's important to note that as far as previously covered organisms go, the area was also home to the Boyan, Bull, Kakatak, Chute, Ghidorah, Menu, Poyu, Ripper, Skullterra, and Yapping Maw. With that out of the way, it's time to take the plunge and see what other unique biota can really be found here, starting with a new pirate entry. Pink Zebesian space pirates were essentially the result of further tinkering with the aquatic technology that was pioneered by the Aqua Pirates forces on Talon 4. In saying this means that they effectively had a pseudo-gravity suit installed in their body, which not only allowed them to move freely in the water, but, more importantly, allowed them to develop gills they could use to stay underwater indefinitely. These monsters were heavily armored and capable of resisting damage from most types of weapons, but they could still be damaged by the extreme forces of power like the Chozo Plasma Beam, among others, and thus is still limited to threat level Gamma. The Sizer was a crustacean that possessed a very crab-like form, but was considered to be amphibious in nature, as it possessed the right anatomical equipment needed to survive both in and out of the water seemingly indefinitely. The standard Sizer possessed a tree of eyes, the ones on the sides being used for basic vision, and the center one being adapted to seeing infrared light in the murky depths of the oceanic areas they called home. They also possess a pair of large, powerful pincers that can inflict minor lacerations where otherwise not strong enough to hurt larger creatures. This did not seem to be much of an issue for these entities though, as they mainly dined on just gastropods, using their pincers to crack their shells. The Sizors excreted a sticky substance from their feet, just like the Zoomer, that allowed them to walk along just about any surface, walls, and ceilings included, and this suited their feeding style very well, as they generally hunted creatures on the land and in the sea equally. Though they might have sometimes been present in larger numbers and possessed different body colors depending upon the resilience of their exoskeletons, these creatures were generally only lightly armored and therefore easily destroyed with basic weapon fire, which is rarely needed anyways, as they are rather benign and do not bother large organisms unless they block their pathways. Needless to say, this means that they usually would not be a problem for most, but their pincers could still deal some notable damage when compounded with their surprising movement speeds, and thus earn a place within threat level Beta. The Avir and their parent guardian Dragon were aquatic arthropods that are relatively rare in the waters of Maridia, but are otherwise some of the more dominant predators and could more than prove to be a dominating presence if needed. With a body form similar to that of a crustacean, the Avir was a human-sized beast with a plated outer shell on its back, a pair of unflinching eyes, and a soft underbelly that was guarded by them fiercely, as was the only part of the body that was actually vulnerable to attack. The Avir lived in sand pits and pools that had been created by space-powered forces in excavating Maridia and setting up a research base. They are generally calm creatures that spent their time dining on smaller arthropods without worrying too much about being attacked, but they were still able to defend themselves by firing the tips of their tail like a straight-shot missile at targets that detonated when they struck as a result of a shock-vulnerable chemical compound contained in the detachable objects, inflicting minor damage and usually deterring targets from attacking again. As observed in the native environment, evirs came in two basic stages of development. When they were young, they possessed a brownish-green shell and body color and lime-green eyes. In this state, they had to feed on plankton because their bodies were too weak and frail for them to sustain much in the way of gunfire and thus lived outside the safety of their parents' lair. Once their shell hardened, however, it would turn green while the belly became yellowish and the eyes shifted to a pink color. It is only in this stage that evirs can be considered a hazard, but while they might have had the strange power to fire right through floors and hurt others above them, potentially due to the explosive nature of the projectile attack, they were still fairly benign and would usually not attack directly unless provoked. As such, they could be avoided if one was careful not to get in their way, and were far from invincible despite their sturdy forms, helping to land them a spot within threat level beta. It is interesting to note that, while queen Metroids are normally the only creatures that have the ability to produce new Metroids, larval Metroids can be forced to undergo asexual reproduction if exposed to large concentrations of beta rays, though the exact reason why is unknown, as the space-powered logs that recorded this process of reproduction have either been lost or locked away by the Galactic Federation. However, it is known this can have some dramatic effects on the creatures as a whole, and is responsible for at least two serious mutations that both turn out far, far different than what they were supposed to be. During the second attack on Zebes by the Hunter, the space power stationed there were experimenting with beta ray exposure and were attempting to clone an army of Metroids from the last surviving infant Metroid, rescued by the Hunter from SR-388 after she had finished wiping out the rest of its kind, in a very short period of time with limited resources. Because they did not have much in the way of technology to work with, the space pirates ended up designing monsters that, while they seemed perfectly normal in their infant state, did not at all turn out as they expected. This mistake in particular was the creation of the Mock-Troids, which were immature infants that are never able to fully mature and acquire the full array of powers. These rejects only had a single nucleus in their bodies, their outer membranes were weak to the point of being flaccid, and their mandibles had so little strength that they could barely hold a grip and could easily be dislodged by simply moving rapidly from side to side. These monsters retained the ability to drain life energy from others, but their power was still much lower, and the drain that they did have was so weak that it required many of them just to equal the power of a single normal Metroid. These creatures were easily destroyed by standard firepower, and were especially weak to the effects of grapple beam technology, as the thin membranes made it easy to electrocute them to death even with relatively low power, and combined with their limited anatomy, it's impossible to rank them any higher than threat level alpha.
You see this? Do you? Do you? This is what happens when you don't pay attention to your studies and work and decide to fly by the seat of your exoskeleton without even remotely thinking about the consequences of your ridiculous actions. If you're going to go to the trouble of exposing Metroids to beta radiation, you need to know the right concentration and duration time for that exposure, or the process will be incomplete and you'll end up with these rejects instead. Call me cruel to say that they don't deserve to exist, but you look at these weak, pathetic beings that can barely even begin to take care of themselves, and tell me how their total extermination would not be a mercy kill in any possible scenario.
The Ohm was a rare aquatic crustacean that is believed to be related to the evirs and Dragon, but otherwise take on a shelled form limited in its mobility for the sake of safety. These creatures, much as with their relatives, possessed a soft belly that could easily be harmed with concussive weaponry, while the rest of their form was covered in a thick, plated exoskeleton for defense. However, the Ohm was set apart from these creatures by both its neon green eye color and especially in the way that it chose to live its life. Unlike the evirs and Dragon, the plated section of the Ohm shell was actually smooth and was able to be flexible more so than normal. As such, these beasts had developed a special latch on the end of their tail region that could be hooked up and around the front of the shell to lock the creature into a ball form. In this state, they couldn't really do much at all aside from roll around and try to squish other creatures, but they adapted to this by evolving a set of appendages that are coated with an extremely lethal toxin. As the Ohm got close to its prey, it would wait until it knew it could attack safely before lashing out with these tentacles from the small spot of fleshy tissue exposed to the head region, piercing and injecting the toxin into the target and waiting as it slowly succumbed to total paralysis within seconds, providing the opportunity for the Ohm to uncurl itself and feed in peace. While the Ohm was much rarer than its relatives and could only survive in small spaces where it could easily corner prey and attack them, they were much harder to hurt than their relatives because their shell was effectively impermeable, and there were no conventional weapons that could make any use of the thin patch of soft flesh exposed near the head. Thankfully, these creatures were relatively benign and could be leaped over if one had access to Morph Ball and Spring Ball technology, and honestly at best placed within threat level alpha, though they still had to be looked out for, as the tentacle attack could deal massive damage against anything they touched, regardless of whether or not they managed to inject their toxic load. The Mediu is a bat-like insectoid known for its nocturnal nature and habit of living within dark environments exclusively. These small creatures had a single pair of small claws they used to grasp the tops of cave ceilings and grab plant life that grew in the walls of said areas, which serves their primary source of sustenance, as well as a single pair of small wings they used for flight. The most notable feature of the creature, however, was its large central eye, which allowed it to see quite clearly in dark caverns. This could be a problem when near the surface in the daytime, however, as the eye of this beast was so sensitive to light that direct exposure to sunlight could easily blind it, rendering it unable to see where it was going. These beasts did not have any form of sonar to help them move around, so they had to remain in dark areas completely in order to eke out any sort of living. Interestingly enough, there is some speculation these creatures may have been cyborgs, as their plated skin and wings seem to be artificial in origin, as did their bizarre ability to pass through solid walls and floors. But the mystery of the biological state of these three creatures will probably never be solved, as they went completely extinct with the destruction of Zebes. Still, as they once were, these creatures really couldn't cause any significant harm to others outside of attacking with their claws, and weren't that resilient, landing them within threat level Alpha. The Ouch was a small mollusk that was traditionally ignored for the most part by larger creatures and was often never seen in person, or at least not until someone accidentally stepped on one. These marine snails live mainly in burrows beneath the sandy bottoms of saltwater bodies and rarely ever poke their body out of the substrate. The only time they would actively reveal themselves was when they would go up to the surface in order to feed, and even then, their visits were usually quite brief. This was a direct reflection of their metabolism, as these entities had the muscles needed to move surprisingly fast along the sandy bottom of their habitat of choice, but in doing so, they expended a lot of energy and thus needed to come up to the surface frequently to acquire more food reserves, causing the entire cycle to begin again. The Ouch itself did not have the ability to offensively harm others, but it was protected by a sturdy shell that was adorned with a series of massive spines that could easily puncture skin and muscle if stepped on without looking, even going so far as to break through the hard exoskeletons of Beastian space pirates and thus annoying them to no end. This defensive trait was only made worse by the fact that their dull green and lavender colored bodies tend to blend in with the sand in Maridia very well, making it harder to spot them until it was too late. If needed, these creatures could be destroyed, but would require a heavy-duty weapon to do so, as their shells were capable of reflecting energy blast and weaker beam weapons, and combined with the contact hazard their forms could often be, it helps to rank them within threat level Beta.
Screw these little shit. I don't care if their form is built the way it is for protection or whatever. They all frickin' suck, and there's every bit of hate I can throw right in their face. If they even had one to begin with. Seriously, it is a literal pain. You walk around the ground not really thinking too much about what you're doing, and then BAM! Little buggers come out of the ground right under your feet and stab you with their damn spiky shells. Throw them on the grill and roast them for all I care. That's about the only use they've got to me.
The Powamp was a marine invertebrate that used the power of air in order to make the most of its limited biological equipment. The main body of the Powamp consisted of little more than a small segmented torso where all the creature's vital organs were crammed into, a massive pair of eyes built for thermal imaging, and a trio of paddle-like appendages that the creature used to slowly paddle through open water. The most definitive feature of the Powamp, though, was the massive flotation sac that was attached to their head. This elastic rubbery sac was filled with varying amounts of air in order to allow the creature to float up and down in the water column, an artificial ballast that made it possible for them to maximize the amount of area they could patrol in their search for small zooplankton to feed on, as was the only prey the gills right below the eyes could feed on. This sac did not just exist for utility purposes though, as it also hid a dark secret for anyone foolish enough to attack these creatures. At the base of this sac, these entities generated a series of artificial spines to help to prop up the sac when it was not inflated with air, making it easier to inflate quickly. If the sac or main body was ruptured by the attack of a predator though, these monsters would fire all of these spines by forcefully blasting water from the gills into the sac above, releasing a torrent of projectiles around them intended to impale and hopefully kill their attacker. This feature alone made these invertebrates worth avoiding at all costs, as they were completely harmless otherwise, but for those with the right equipment, they could actually be quite useful, as they could be frozen readily to be used as platforms and had enough magnetic materials constructed into the exoskeleton for protection that they could be latched onto with grapple beam technology, making them fit for threat level Alpha. The shack tool was a simple digging robot that was built by the Zebesian space pirates in order to carve out the sand that filled many of the caverns of Maridia and Zebes before the Zebesian space pirates were able to create a second base on the planet after the resurrection of Mother Brain. The shack tool consisted of a main body with a helmet-like shape to it and a pair of eye bands that came together in a T-shape that allowed the machine to see with great textural efficiency, enabling it to easily discern between solid rock and sand by closely analyzing the physical nature and texture of the material from afar, assisted by a color scanner located in the back of its ocular system. The arms of the shack tool were made from a series of energized gears attached to a pair of massive spike rolling appendages that could pierce even somewhat hard sand and carve it out with incredible excavation skill. These machines were relatively simple in terms of programming and were armed with only the most basic of mental capacities, just enough so they could do their job and carve out sandy areas when they were presented with such an obstacle. Direct damage can only really come about as a result of direct contact with the digging wheels, but this also serves as the housing for important neurocircuitry and was in turn the only parts of their body that are vulnerable to direct damage, which they could take a decent amount of before they would no longer be able to operate. These machines were generally best left alone as they would usually deactivate once they were done clearing out an area, but getting around them could still be a bit tricky as they could only move in short motions, their arms swinging around and over the head to carve out material limb by limb. Nonetheless, they could still be used to one's advantage, as they were not that picky about where they excavated and could thus be used to dig out tunnels and access new areas that might otherwise have been inaccessible, making them a serious blessing in disguise for most explorers and properly assigned within threat level Alpha.
You know, they really don't make them like they used to. And in this case, I mean the simple yet effective design of this kind of machine. It doesn't have a hell of a lot of bells and whistles to it at all, oh no. All it needs are a pair of arms and some spoke ends to tunnel through and break hard sand and make its way through what otherwise would be a pain in the ass to excavate by hand. We need more machines like this, and less like that overzealous juggernaut from SL388, but I'll save away for that overloaded death trap for another time.
The Totori and his offspring Totori Jr. were large turtles that existed in the more secluded spots of Maridia, away from most other creatures, where they could live and reproduce in relative peace. As an infant, the Totori Jr. was a fairly benign creature that was once adored for its cute appearances and childish intelligence. The large brown shell that covered its orange body was large enough to almost completely encompass their form, and as a result, they were very slow-moving and had no other way to defend themselves. Thankfully for them, this is all that they needed, as the shells were made from some of the hardest organic material in all of Zebes, and were effectively indestructible in most cases. Even so, their small bodies could easily be flipped over with a few jumps on them or a direct attack, but this was usually not a good idea as this exposed their vulnerable underbellies, which was still almost impossible to destroy, just less so, and would oftentimes send their mother into a raging fit. The adult Totori, in comparison to his cute offspring, was an easily irritated monster with a massive gnarled shell that was essentially impossible to penetrate with any reasonable amount of firepower and was immune to almost any feasible portable weapon system. Aside from being much larger, the adult Totori was distinguished from its young by its massive gnarled head, its 4 powerful limbs, and a bulbous rock-hard tail covered in spines perfect for crushing bone and similar structures. The Totori was usually a very benign creature and fed on seaweed alongside its young, but if the beast was angered, primarily by attacking its young, it would enter a fury and pull in all of its limbs, head, and tail before using its hard tail to swing it into rotation, causing the shell to spin and fly towards the defending target in the water. This could be used to one's advantage as the shell could still be jumped upon and would rise up in such situations, allowing the rider to reach parts of the vertical caverns they dwelled in that are otherwise inaccessible, but they still need to be approached cautiously as the shells could inflict a considerable amount of trauma when they impacted something and were thus a force to be reckoned with. Overall, the Totori and their offspring were generally safe creatures to be around, but also usually best left to their own devices, especially since the adults did not take kindly to those playing with the offspring without permission, and would gladly crush anyone foolish enough to think that they could easily handle them, landing them directly into threat level Beta.
I really like all the games I've been playing, so teams are very much really possible actually unless you really fucking. Come on, man. We don't want to get with this hero or nothing else. God, they might never get too close to that once. All we can trust in that blood shark can go out of nowhere and pull me to a hole. Within a build bit bigger than most, I might end up very rich. Like that. So, both things like that.
The yard was an uncommon mollusk only known to naturally exist in the waters of Maridia and Zebes that is usually less of a concern than most of the wildlife there as a result of the limited offensive capabilities. Unlike other mollusks, these creatures actually possess some hard parts aside from the shell in the form of 2 small crab-like pinchers that they used to grasp onto prey and hold them down while they spat a corrosive enzyme that liquefied them into a form that the yard could then easily devour. Its small, stalked eyes were not the best when it came to seeing complex shapes and colors, but they did have a limited visual system that allowed them to see enough in the way of basic colors and shapes to get through their lives. While these monsters were relatively brutal against creatures that were smaller than them, they were not powerful enough to be a serious threat towards humans, as the most they could do to attack was aggressively ram a target when it wasn't paying attention. Thankfully for the yard though, they didn't have to worry too much about offense, as the shell they had was so sturdy that it could not be harmed by basic beam and missile weapons, requiring morph ball bombs, power bombs, or the speed booster to break. Moreover, if they came in direct contact with something, the yard would quickly pull its body into its shell and would allow it to be kicked around, bouncing off hard surfaces until its attacker gave up, and it could safely come back out or launch a counterattack. Yards were uncommon enough that they probably would not be a serious threat to most, but they should nonetheless have been watched to ensure they didn't try anything too sneaky, since they were actually able to move surprisingly fast, and thus rank within threat level Alpha. The Zoa were small, shrimp-like crustaceans that made their home in the sand pits of Maridia prior to the destruction of Zebes. These simple creatures possessed a small, shrimp-like body with a strong purple coloration, violet eyes, and a pair of small raptorial appendages on the front of their body. These creatures fed off of small microorganisms that dwelled in the sand pits that they called home, using a series of fine hairs on their raptorial appendages to pick them up from loose sand grains and deliver them to the small mouthparts on the underside of their body. Up until their end with the destruction of Zebes, these creatures had formed an exclusive network of tunnels and pits within the sandy reaches of Maridia, where they were able to live and reproduce in safety in large nests, much as seen with creatures like the Zeb that formed the homes and the networks of air holes scattered across the interior of Zebes. Most of the time, these creatures would remain in the ground and not bother other life forms, but when they sensed the presence of a large, potentially dangerous life form above them through disturbances in the surrounding rock units, which they could detect using the small green sensory appendages on their heads, they would exit their nesting area and try to ram their attackers backwards, thrusting a small spine of their backs into the target in an effort to repel their attack. As far as monsters go, these creatures were very weak and could usually only sustain a shot or two from a weapon, but they could still fly quite fast, and the habit of appearing in large numbers at once could make it difficult to handle them all at once without getting hit, though a fast trigger finger and proper evasion skills could still render the threat a moot point, and turn occupying a solid niche in threat level Alpha. The Bot Woon was a serpent-like creature that spent most of its life living in a small network of tunnels that carved into the rocks of its nesting site, usually far out of sight and protected from the few creatures capable of actually doing it harm. Though similar appearance in biology to earth snakes with an elongated body form, yellow scales on their belly, and red ribbed ones on top, the Bot Woon was a unique reptilian creature of its own that adapted from a life on land to one in the water, and seemed to have no problem making up for the difference in anatomy. The fact that only one of its kind was ever encountered in Zebes suggests that it may have actually been imported from a different planet by the Zebesian space pirates. Under normal circumstances, this creature was a fairly benign beast that only fed on small fish and invertebrates, using its paddle-like tail to quickly maneuver through the water with its crocodilian teeth to grab and rip prey to shreds. However, if it felt that its nesting site was being invaded, the monster would become extremely aggressive and would attack forcefully to repel any potential threat from its home. In terms of attacks, the Bot Woon's mouth was its primary form of offense, and was really the only thing it needed in order to deliver its most painful strikes. But if it wished to attack an enemy from afar, it was possible for it to spew a wave of hardened skin clumps made from its shed exoskeleton that it ate and processed through a separate stomach in the middle of its body. The Bot Woon would usually utilize its nesting grounds as its primary tool of avoidance, as the beast could readily swim into and from any of the holes in its nesting site and move through the complex tunnels that it dug to escape detection, only ever popping out its head to attack or move to a different hole. Why it made its tunnels so complex is still not well understood, but it's possible that it adapted this as a deterrent against any predator that might be foolish enough to try and crawl in. Regardless, the only vulnerable part of the Bot Woon was its head, and although the sole specimen encountered by the hunter took quite a bit of punishment from her and seemed to only move faster as its body began to increasingly weaken, it ultimately keeled over from physical trauma and fell apart in a piecemeal fashion after dying, and in turn has a distinct place within threat level Beta.
You see this thing? Bah! If I'm supposed to be afraid of something that's little more than an overgrown snake with sharp teeth, then you got another thing coming. Seriously, if this is supposed to be a threat to me, then I've got nothing to really say. Coward just likes to hide in all the damn holes that's built for its nest. Maybe spit something at you every once in a while, but that's about it. Someone needs some lessons on predatory skill if you ask me.
The parent entity of the Veers in Maridia was Dragon, one of the major spacecraft commanders used by Mother Brain before the destruction of Planet Zebes. It is unclear how exactly Dragon got involved in the spaceflight operations, but it's hypothesized that Zebesians came into contact with the aquatic monster as they were excavating the area to build a research base, and Mother Brain was able to convince the creature to help them in exchange for protection over its offspring. Needless to say, Dragon proved to be a fairly efficient commander, as it helped the space pirates excavate some of the deeper portions of the wet world, and directed them in the construction of advanced gravity suit technology that would be put to use in the creation of the Pink Zebesian space pirate. Aside from this, however, Dragon did not really pay much attention to the politics of the realm, and made no attempt to leave Maridia, though this is mainly due to the simple fact that the beast could not survive out of the water. The hunter did eventually come to interact and fight with the beast, but in the end, Dragon proved incapable of fully handling the bounty hunter's agility and ingenuity, and was ultimately destroyed by her, only to be safely buried by its offspring into the sandy floor of its nesting site out of respect for their fallen parent. Dragon possessed a body that was superficially similar to that possessed by the Avir, but it had been severely elongated and its back plates had been moved down to its tail and essentially replaced with a massively thick hide that covered virtually every part of its body, save for the soft underbelly it and the rest of its kind possessed. The monster's elongated skull possessed a large and complex brain structure that was not observed in the younger Evirs that allowed it to not only think intelligently, but also converse with other life forms, though in the case of the Zebesian space pirates, Mother Brain likely had to act as a translator between the two. Dragon's large eyes made it perfect for living in the dark, as his eyes were built for being able to see in very low levels of light, which also might explain why Dragon never traveled much closer to the surface where it might have easily been blinded by intense light. The monster's circular toothy maw was relatively small compared to the rest of its body, but was still more than capable of biting through just about any type of soft and medium range armor that it can get its appendages on. While Dragon could simply slam its body into other creatures in order to deal damage, it is also equipped with a tail structure hidden beneath the remaining plates of its body carried over from its juvenile stage as an Evir, and this tail is not only equipped with a large fin for paddling rapidly through the water, but also possessed a large stinger on the end, which Dragon would use in order to viciously stab at any prey item that can get its legs on. In terms of combat capabilities, Dragon did not have much in the way of direct physical offense aside from physical strikes from its body and tail, though it could spit out globules of sticky goo in order to trap prey and enemies alike, slowing them down so Dragon had a chance to grab them with its 8 stubby legs and then impale them to death with its tail. In addition, Dragon had a trio of wall cannons installed in the walls of its nesting room in order to grant an extra bit of firepower and distraction to anyone that dared to enter his domain. Sadly though, Dragon did not anticipate the firepower of the hunter, and these cannons ultimately proved to be their downfall. Since Dragon's belly was unprotected, the hunter used her most powerful concussive weapons to damage the beast, but as Dragon took more and more damage, its movements and ferocity only seemed to increase. To eliminate some of the cover fire, the hunter used her missile weapons to destroy the cannons on the sides of the nesting room, only to see them start sparking with electricity, giving her an idea. Willing to risk her own life, she allowed Dragon to capture her and start to attack her, but as soon as the two got within reach of one of these sparking cannon bases, the hunter lashed out with her grapple beam and established a connection with the machine. The resulting surge of electricity hurt her a bit, but it hurt Dragon far more, and effectively electrocuted the monster to death, ending its reign as the leader of the space pirates. While this latter issue in hindsight was an unwise move for Dragon to make, given that the cover fire that was supposed to help it ended up leading to its demise in the heat of battle, it was still an effective combatant and did whatever it could to defend itself, its offspring, and the Zebesian space pirates. And given its otherwise incredibly hard, sturdy hide and limited weak points, Dragon overall ranks within threat level Delta, and was not a fiend that most would ever want to encounter alone.
You know, normally I would be here quipping about this massive hunk of ugly, and being kinda glad it was more than 6 feet under, but, to be honest, not really feeling that with this one. Sure, Dragon had to face not even its boss with love, let alone want to see, and I wouldn't be caught dead trying to make any sort of kids with it, but, you know, it seems like it only helped Mother Brain to keep its kid safe. And I can't really make fun of that. Used to love my mom back when she was even still alive, and I ain't a mama's boy, but you gotta have some level of respect for those willing to do something not pleasant just to bring you into the world, you know? I don't miss Dragon, but I can get why someone would be desperate to keep their kind safe, and they were convinced that joining the big brain was the only way to go. So, yeah, sorry there, Dragon. At least your kids didn't suffer too much when your whole race went kablooey.
This watery world may not have looked to be all that terrifying at first, but what it lacked in the way of inherent danger at first glance, it more than made up in being a location where travel for most explorers could be a pain and a serious danger to their overall livelihood. The aquatic denizens of Maridia may not all have been among the most dangerous of beasts or the most aggressive of predators, but the few that did fall to those ranks could be difficult to deal with without powerful weaponry like the plasma beam to cut through them. Moreover, the fact that most of the land was completely flooded with water meant that getting around and maneuvering through the water could be a huge problem without the benefit of some form of gravity suit technology or anything similar to make moving through it easier. As such, while it was a lovely place to explore with different aesthetics to its different components the deeper one would go, it could equally be a hazard to just get around in, and was only fit to explore by the most talented and skilled of divers out there. That was a heck of a dip into the deep waters of the now long-gone Zebes, but don't worry too much about drying off, as the next locale we'll be examining should do that just fine. However, it would also more than require you to bring out the thermal gear once more, as we'll really be heading into the deep bowels of Zebes next, as we take a trip into the superheated land of Lower Norfair, also known as Ridley's Lair. Thank you all for watching this video. We here at Space Pirate Science Team take our work very seriously, and we genuinely wish to be as informative as possible when it comes to the work we conduct here, for both ourselves and in the name of science. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and comment to help us get greater recognition out there to inform the greater populace of the universe as a whole. Also, feel free to keep track of us through Twitter, as we'll be posting notices there every time something new is submitted for your viewing pleasure. We hope to see you all in the next video, no matter what world it may take us to.